Quran by Quran interpretation approach, a comparative study of Tabatabai and Islahi's method. I was thinking what topic to talk about for this session, given that I'm interested in Quranic studies. And I thought, because of variety of people who may listen to this or may listen to this later, maybe I can do a comparative study from for two scholars, one from the Shi'i background and one from the Sunni al-Sunnah wal-Jama'ah background. But two scholars that both of them are actually trying to adopt the same approach, that is Quran by Quran. So in this way, I thought maybe there can be something new for anybody who is listening to this. So I'm going to introduce these two to you very quickly. I'm going to do a comparison of their work on the basis of three commonly known difficult verses of the Quran. I'm going to reach some concluding remarks in the form of schematic illustration of the two methods. I'm going to propose some further research. So I go through these one by one. So to start with, this is Amin Ahsan Islahi, 1904 to 1997. He was born in India, and after partition, he moved to the newly made Pakistan. He was first involved in some political activities with Ma'dudi, but very soon decided to leave all politics out and just concentrate on his studies and on the Quran. He is considered as one of the most significant interpreters of the Quran in among the Muslim scholarship in Pakistan and India. And already there are schools called Islahi school that you can find in both India and Pakistan. He had one single main significant teacher, who is Hamiduddin Farahi, again from India, 1863 to 1930. And Hamiduddin Farahi was an expert in language, in particular Arabic. He himself was interpreter of the Quran. And basically, Islahi spent something like 20, 30 years with Hamiduddin Farahi in the traditional way of tutelage that used to be the method of studying under scholars at the time in the place. And he studied Quran under the tutelage of Hamiduddin Farahi. If I want to single out one main thing about the method of Hamiduddin Farahi, I would say the emphasis on language, but even more important than that, what he considers to be coherence in the Quran, Nazm Quran. We then have Muhammad Hussain Tabatabai, which I think many of you know him, of course, 1903 to 1981. He was a great mufassir of the Quran among the Shia scholarship. He was interested, and his approach was interpreting the Quran by the Quran. He was philosopher. He was faqih, although his philosophy and his work on the Quran was more significant. He was student of many teachers, and he had many students himself as well. Ali Qazi Tabatabai is one of his main teachers, and the one that he himself says that he learned a lot from him in terms of how to understand the Quran. People who know this, of course, do know that the family names are Tabatabai for both of them, but that doesn't mean that they are related. Tabatabai here, I think, simply refers to the fact that both of them were Sayyid, from father and mother. It is very interesting that these two scholars lived, as you can see, exactly at the same time. In fact, I think they even look very much the same in face. And both of them were very humble. Both of them were experts in the language of Arabic. Both of them wrote tafsir, exegesis of the Quran. Both of them used Quran by Quran interpretation, but unfortunately they never met. Obviously, there wasn't email or Facebook or things like that at the time. Let us look at the books of the main book of tafsir, the books of tafsir of these two great scholars. So this is Tadabbur Quran. It is in 9 volumes. It's around 5,008 pages. I don't that doesn't mean that much of scientific meaning. It depends on the size of the page, but just to get a sense of it. It was completed within 35 years. It is originally in Urdu. It is only partially translated into English. This is Al-Mizan fi Tafsir al-Quran. The original volumes were 20 volumes. This is around 8,000 pages. It's much more in detail when you compare it to Tadabbur Quran. It was completed within 20 years. I don't think that means that Islahi has done more or has done or it was less than Tabatabai has done. One of the reasons that I think Tabatabai managed to do this faster, of course, beside his own talent and hard work, was the team of students that also helped him. Islahi did not appear to have that sort of team of students helping him. Original in Arabic, a full translation in Persian, partially translated into English, Turkish, and Russian. It may have been translated in some other language partially as well, but these are the main ones that I'm aware of. I don't want to, because this is going to be a case study approach, so I'm not going to go back to the references and bring out the approach that they have adopted based on those references. I want to do this based on case study, meaning looking at some verses. So before that, I just want to give a quote from each one of them so that you can see how they see Quran by Quran interpretation. So from Islahi, this is not my translation, of course. It says, I have relied on the Quran not only in ascertaining coherence of verses and interpretation of meaning, but in resolving the difficulties. This is not because of the lack of lexical or philological evidence, but because the Quran is the most reliable authority on its message and meaning. Tabatabai says, and that is my translation, the Quran says, and we sent this book to you that is explanation for everything. It is not possible that the Quran would be explanation for everything and not explanation for itself. How can the Quran be guidance for all that people need? For all that people need? How can the Quran be guidance for all that people need, but do not fulfill people's need to understand it? So basically, both of them, as you see, are saying the same thing. That is, Quran explains itself, and we are trying to derive and get this explanation. Both of them, however, make it clear in their introduction that doesn't mean that we just sit down and just concentrate on the Quran. Of course, we consult other tafasir, other works of exegesis. Of course, we look at the narrations and ahadith. However, our main point of emphasis is to understand things from the Quran, and those will be secondary tools for us. Both of them have said that in a way, and both of them have shown that that is the way that they have tried to do it. So, a brief on this comparative study. How have I done it? So, I chose 3 verses that are known as difficult verses, al-ayatul mushkila. I considered the author's own explanation of their method in the introduction of their books. Of course, you can imagine that these are not the only verses of the Quran for which I have looked at the interpretation of these scholars. I have been student of both of them on a regular basis, indirect student, of course, studying their books. So I also rely on my own study of the 2 methods, but I have tried to bring out the key elements of their method using these 3 case studies. And based on that, I have formulated an overall view from this for easy comparison. So you will see that overall view at the end. So starting, there are 3 case studies, and I try to go through them one by one. What I would like to ask you is that do not worry if you were not sure about some of the details when I say, for instance, that Tabatabai looked at that verse and made such and such conclusion. Obviously, when you don't see that verse, when you haven't read the analysis, the reasoning of Tabatabai itself, it will be difficult for you to fully understand, okay, how that was. But that is not the point. Please remember that in looking at these case studies, we are not trying to understand how this case study in detail was. We are trying to understand the method. So please do consider the overall method that I'm trying to bring out from these case studies. So case study 1, Nisa 159. إن من أهل الكتاب إلا ليؤمنن به قبل موته ويوم القيامة يكون عليهم شهيدا. And there is not one of the followers of the book, but most certainly believes in him before his death, and on the day of resurrection he shall be a witness against them. Question: who believes in who by whose death? So you can see in the tafasir of the Mufassirin, there's a huge debate about this. Number 1, to start with, when it says Ahl al-Kitab, does that mean all Ahl al-Kitab, all people of the book? Then when it says La yu'minanna bihi, they will believe in him, believe in who? And then when it says Qabla mawtihi, before his death, before whose death? Of course, this verse is within the context of story of Jesus. So the verses before talk about story of Jesus, the point that Quran makes, that Jesus was not put on the cross, he did not die on the cross, and then this comes and these questions arise. So let's look at how Tabatabai approached this, and then we'll look at how Islahi approached it. So to make it easy, because I know it can be confusing, in particular when you look at this online, and you may lose focus easily. I have put Tabatabai in green in every slide, and I have put his picture there as well, and you will see that I have put Islahi in blue and his picture on the other side, so that you can easily notice that, okay, this is Tabatabai, all right, that is Islahi. So Tabatabai, what does he do? He first explains the literal meaning of the keywords. So he brings out the words and he talks about the Arabic aspects of it and the meaning of it, and goes back to some of the books of Lughat and talks about them. He points out what the disagreement is. Now, Tabatabai does not emphasize much about any disagreement on Ahl al-Kitab itself, but he emphasizes on La yu'minanna bihi and qabla mawtihi. So it does say that, yeah, the disagreement is believe in who and before whose death. That is the question. He then brings out the main views and briefly comments on them as well. So he says that one of the main views is that it refers to people of the book before their own death. He then comments on this, that if it refers to Jesus, then that brings unnecessary specification or takhsis to people of the book, because one may argue that not all people of the book witnessed Jesus. He says another interpretation is that it refers to people of the book before Jesus' death. So it will be people of the book at the time of return of Jesus on that basis. So qabla mawtihi, this ha here, in one view, it will be people of the book themselves, death of the people of the book themselves dying. Before their death, they will believe in Jesus. The other one is that before Jesus' death, they believe in him. Then Tabatabai provides his own view, and he kind of supports the second view. He says the second view is correct, but he then also says that, however, it includes all people of the book. All people of the book, whether they have witnessed Jesus or not. And he explains how this can be possible. He brings reasoning. In reasoning, he talks about siyaq. Now, if you look at the Al-Mizan by Tabatabai, you will find that there's lots of mentioning siyaq and siyaq and siyaq. In almost every few verse, Tabatabai talks about siyaq, the siyaq of the verse, the siyaq. I put the word context for it because I found that in many places they translate siyaq as context, but I think it's actually more than context. It's context. It is also link and relationship between every word. But I just put context here. So he says that my view that it refers to Jesus is due to the context of the verse. It's due to the verses that comes before reference to the verse in Ma'idah. He makes reference to the verse in Ma'idah to argue that in his time of presence on the face of earth, Jesus is witness to all people of the book. So it brings that as a reason as well. As I said, don't worry if you do not fully understand this reasoning. I want you to please concentrate on the overall method, which I'm going to summarize later. He then again goes back and brings possible arguments against his views and then start responding to them. So for instance, he says, yes, there are verses that show that Jews will not believe in Jesus. However, I, meaning Tabatabai, said that based on this verse, all of them will believe in Jesus. He then explains that. He does say that they'll believe here does not mean that belief that Quran that normally Quran is talking about, and also he explains that it is not necessary that interpretation can be taken from other verses of the Quran. He brings out verses that may suggest that there are Jews after the final death of Jesus on his return, because he does believe in return of Jesus. And then he says that those verses can be interpreted differently. He makes some brief criticism of some rare views, and then he goes to discussion of narrations. After every group of verses that Tabatabai talks about, he goes on to bring out some narrations. So he brings these narrations for you. Most normally, it's from both Shia and Sunni sources. And then the way that he approaches these narrations is that he tries to show that what he understood from the Quran by Quran approach is in line with one or some group of these narrations. And for the other ones, he either justifies them, or he says these are not relevant, or he says the hadith is not reliable, or he says that this hadith is about a very specific mistaq, a very specific example or application of that verse, and not all the meaning of that verse. So that is the way that Tabatabai looks at this verse. Let us then look at the way that Islahi looks at it. So imagine, consider please, that both scholars say that they are using Quran by Quran approach. So this is Islahi. Islahi considers the main subject of chapter 4, Surah An-Nisa, to be completed by verse 128. You can check that later, what verse 128 is. He considers the rest to be answering questions by Muslims, hypocrites, and people of the book, Jews specifically. He then says that question from people of the book starts from verse 153, where they ask the Prophet to send them a book descending from heaven. So in verse 153 in Surah An-Nisa is the verse in which it says that people of the book are saying to the Prophet, why don't you just have a book dropped from heaven to you? What is this revelation, gradual revelation? Why you cannot have just one book coming to you? Because Jews in particular, because of the understanding that they had from the way that Torah, or at least the 10 Commandments, were revealed. Islahi then considers verses 154 to 158 to be criticizing Jews, criticizing them in terms of the way that they dealt with Jesus, etc. He considers verse 159 to go back to 153, that is on the subject of the Quran. So he therefore concludes that the verse is actually saying that all people of the book at the time of the Prophet will become convinced about the Quran before his death, before the death of the Prophet. Okay, all the people of the book at the time of the Prophet will become convinced about the Quran before Prophet's death. So as you can see, he comes up with a totally different understanding from the way that Tabatabai talks about. Tabatabai relates this to the verses before and concentrates on Jesus. Amin Hassan Islahi relates this to the verses much earlier and therefore argues for Quran rather than Jesus here. Interestingly enough, he considers this to be warning in line with the theme of the group of chapters in which Surah An-Nisa is located. So he looks at the theme of this group of chapters. Interestingly enough, Tabatabai, of course, he didn't know Islahi, of course, but refers to such interpretation, and he writes my translation. This interpretation is the same as the one before in terms of being irrational and baseless. This is because before this verse, there is no mention of Muhammad, so that the verse could relate to it. And this is irrelevant to the state of this verse. Basically, what Islahi has done is that you don't need to read that. I just want to show you the structure. This is from verse 153 to 159. Verse 159 is the difficult verse that we are looking at. What Islahi says is that, look, this part is just like a footnote. It's just like a bracket. These two verses are actually related to each other. So this is talking about Quran, not Jesus. Case study 2. Therefore, keep waiting for the day when the sky shall bring on evident smoke. That is verse 44 in Surah Al-Dukhan. So then the question would be, what does evident smoke mean? So again, talking about Tabatabai, again, he explains the literal meaning of the keywords. He does say that there are disagreements about what this evident smoke is. He says that there are 4 main interpretations. Some say it was famine that came to Mecca. Some say it refers to end of the world. Some say it refers to capture of Mecca. And some say it refers to what will happen in the Day of Judgment. He then accepts A and B and rejects C and D. But this is one of the features of Tabatabai's work that I will get back to it later, that he does not necessarily has this reservation that I need to definitely come to one final definite interpretation. If he finds that, yeah, it can be interpreted in a different way as well, he does not shy saying that, yeah, there are 2 ways of interpreting it. And he goes on explaining both of them. In many places, he does not make it clear which one he prefers. He just says these 2 are possible. So as you can see, that is one of those cases that he accepts A and B, that punishment could be famine or that can be end of the world, and he rejects C and D based on the context. So he interprets the verse based on the last 2 views. So the rest of the discussion that Tabatabai has here, he is explaining the verses that come after based on each one of these 2 interpretations. So he says that, look, in the verse after, which is verse 11, where it says people will panic, yeah, he says it will mean people of Mecca based on option A. It will mean everybody based on option B. In verse 15, where it says that if the punishment is lifted a little, they will get, in verse 15, where it says, if the punishment is lifted a little, they will get back. It says for A, it means getting back to their ways. For B, it means getting back to the punishment in the hereafter. So that's the way that Tabatabai works on this. Rejects 2, accepts 2, and interprets based on those 2. And then, of course, he discusses the narrations, same style as before. Let us look at Islahi. What Islahi does is that he says that the chapter of Dukhan is paired to the chapter of Zukhruf. Now, one thing that I forgot to say, and let me say it just now. there is a huge difference between the way that Tabatabai and Islahi look at the order of the chapters of the Quran and order of the verses. Tabatabai seems like he does not agree that the order of the chapters were divine. In fact, I think I try to make a very humble statement. He definitely does not agree that the order of chapters were divine. He says it was ijtihad of Sahaba. The companions just came up with this order. He even sometimes, although very rare, but sometimes he even questions the placement of the verses. So for instance, when he talks about verse 33, the verse of riches, he says that this verse seems to should be in a different place, and it has been put in this place perhaps by mistake or some other motives. On the other hand, Islahi considers the order of the chapters of the Quran to be divine. The same order that we have it today. He considers that to be divine, and definitely considers the placement of verses to be divine. And then he comes up with putting these chapters of the Quran into 7 groups, and for each group he comes up with a different theme. So it says group 1 has this theme, group 2 has that theme, and in each group he argues that most of the chapters are in pairs, like Baqarah and Ali Imran. They're in pairs, so one touches on the same topic as the other one, but from a different angle. So here he says that chapter of Dukhan is paired to chapter of Zukhruf. In Zukhruf, the emphasis is on monotheism. In Dukhan, it is on warning. He then says verses 1 to 16 are referring to the exalted nature of the Quran and the punishment for those who arrogantly reject it among the Quraysh. He then considers this evident smoke to be literally a punishment that the Quraysh were warned about. An unusually strong hurricane that is supposed to come to you if you do not accept this message. He dismisses the option that this is about day of judgment due to the context, rejects the narrations that suggest that. He dismisses the option that is about famine based on context, and he questions again the narrations, and also he talks about it based on linguistic. He says that Dukhan and Mubin cannot be translated or interpreted as famine. He refers to the Arab poetry at the time, as well as some other verses of the Quran, and says this Dukhan and Mubin, evident smoke, was a punishment that was going to be something similar to what for people of Ad and Thamud came. So he took it literally in that way. Right. The third case study. وَإِن مِّنكُمْ إِلَّا وَارِدُهَا كَانَ عَلَى رَبِّكَ حَتْمًا مَقْضِيًّا ثُمَّ نُنَجِّي الَّذِينَ اتَّقَوْا وَنَذَرُ الظَّالِمِينَ فِيهَا جِثِيًّا. And there is not one of you but shall come to it, meaning hell. This is an unavoidable decree of your Lord. Excuse me. Then we will save the pious and leave the oppressors in it, fallen on their knees. Question: do all people enter hell? So again, you will find that for this verse, there are many explanations. How does that work? Do all people go to hell, and then the good ones come out of it, and the others stay in it? How is that going to work? So let's see how Tabatabai is approaching this. So again, he explains the literal meaning of the keywords. He then talks about the main views. So people will stay at the edge of the fire. That is one view. This is based on other instances of use of derivatives of wurud, entering. And Tabatabai challenges such conclusion from those verses. So although he explains that, he challenges that. And he says, well, some counter arguments can be given like this, that wurud here means just coming and stay at the edge of the fire. He then talks about the other interpretation, that means all people will enter the hell. Of course, the hell is not, for instance, the fire is not there yet, and then the pious will be saved. he then comes up with his own view. He says it means merely presence without entering. He analyzes and interprets a number of the other verses with derivatives of wurud like this as well. Now, this is very interesting, the way that Tabatabai do this. You see, his own view that says it is merely presence is actually the same as the first view that says they just stay at the edge of the fire. It's almost the same thing. However, when he raises the first view, he brought some counter arguments that, you know, the people who come up with this view, they come up with these reasons, and this is the counter argument. He then agrees and accepts that same view. However, he brings different arguments. It is very interesting. It is, when you read Tabatabai's Mizan, you feel that he's not just caring to tell you his views. He's actually trying to teach you how to analyze the verses of the Quran. Arguments, counter arguments. He says something, and you start feeling that, okay, so this is his view. And then later on, you find that he rejects it. He says something that says this cannot be right because of these reasons, and you say, okay, so he does not agree with that. And then later on, he agrees with that based on different reasons. So you get this feeling that he's trying to teach you. It's not just giving you the interpretation. He then does some further analysis, and this is where it becomes very interesting. He says, what if one says that forget about the meaning of the word, etc. What if one says that entering is for all because of the nature of the human being? He rejects this on the basis of the part of the verse that says this is an unavoidable decree of your Lord. So he said, look, it comes from God. It is not coming from nature of human being. This is the one that actually I wanted to say interesting. It's this one, number 5. However, mentions that one can still argue that wurud is in fact entering if one considers saving the pious, I'm sure I didn't get the word right, but saving the pious and leaving the oppressors to be literally related. This is what is interesting. He talks about all different views. He analyzes them. He rejects some of them. He accepts some of them. He then comes up with his own view. He gives you the reasoning, and that's the point that you think that, okay, that's us. Let's move on. And then suddenly he drops this for you. That, however, having said all of that, if somebody argues like this, then there is a possibility that a different view may be entertained and accepted. And this is what I mean, that it is as if Tabatabai is trying to teach you rather than just give you the explanation. And of course, then discussion of narrations come. Let us look at Islahi. Islahi actually takes this very easy. He says, of you here goes back to the verse before that were about infidels. It has nothing to do with other than infidels. He says that the change of addressing from third person to second person is a style of classical Arabic to show strength and severity. Most interpreters did not see this point due to not considering this oration-related technique in the classic Arabic. So basically, it says there's nothing to discuss here. There's nothing to worry about. Minkum, among you, is actually goes back to kuffar. It has nothing to do with others. And the rest of the verse that is summa nunajji, then we are going to save others. That does not mean that they were in the hellfire. I have something like 5-7 minutes, and I only have another 2 slides to go. I happened to see one of the comments that came up. If I manage to saw it quickly, at this point, when I talked about oration, I think it's good for me to quickly address that comment as well. When I was showing you this one, this one, I think a comment came that how does he justify this jump from that verse to this verse? How can he eliminate those few in interpretation? this is in fact one of the arguments that Islahi has, and mind you, many other mufassirs agree with that. Tabatabai himself also agrees with that. That it is one of the features of the style of the Quran, which is very similar to the style of oration, that you jump from one topic to that you're talking about one topic, then you leave it for a while and talk about something different that can be a side topic or a secondary topic. Then you come back to the main argument. So this is nothing strange, and even Tabatabai has instances like that. Okay, so these were the 3 case studies that I talked about. Let me now try to summarize that. As I said, I tried to summarize these 2 approaches with the use of some schematic models. So let's see what I came up with. So Islahi, because he has this assumption that the chapters of the Quran are in the divine order, and Makki and Madani are next to each other, but that there's a reason for that, and it comes with pairs of chapters and all that. So he comes up with theme of the Quran, general theme of the Quran, and he says that the general theme of the Quran is inzar, warning. He then comes up with what is the theme of each group of those 7 groups of the Quran. So he talks about these groups one by one. What is the theme of them? He then talks about theme of the group of verses in which the verse is located. He then looks at similar related verses, and from there he arrives at final conclusion, though starting that at the start. There's a reason that I wrote though stating that at the start. I will explain that in the next slide. So Islahi's approach is just like this, from what he considers to be the whole Quran to then one group of the chapters of the Quran, and then one chapter of the Quran, then one group of verses in the Quran, and then that verse. What Tabatabai does is that he discusses different possibilities and then propose an interpretation. Islahi does not discuss different possibilities. If one interpretation that he disagrees with is very famous, he just mentions it and says why it is wrong, and then he goes on to explain himself. Tabatabai discusses the main interpretations, then comes up with his own interpretation, bringing other verses and rational arguments for and against the proposed interpretation. As I tried to show you in my case studies, he often goes like a circle to do that in different layers, in different levels. So he brings some verses, makes an argument about it, gives you some temporary conclusion. He then questions that conclusion, goes back to the verse, interprets in a different way, comes up with a different interpretation, and just goes on and on until he gets to the final conclusion that he believes in. So often he arrives at final conclusion at the end. Most cases, in some cases, as you saw, arrives at final conclusion with a hint that another interpretation may be possible. And at some points, he proposed more than one possible interpretation, as I showed you for that verse. I was thinking, if I want to summarize these 2 approaches by one word, what word would I choose? I would say for Islahi, it is holistic approach. For Tabatabai, I would say it is analytic approach. One thing I want to make it very clear, that does not mean that I think that Islahi did not do analysis in his tafsir, or that Tabatabai did not look at the whole Quran in his tafsir. No, of course Islahi also had analysis, and of course Tabatabai also looked at the whole. However, when you compare their tafsir together, like what I tried to do with those 3 case studies, that's what remains outstanding for you. Holistic for Islahi, analytic for Tabatabai. I have 3 minutes, and I'm going to sum it up. Summary of the comparison. So Islahi, holistic approach, Tabatabai, analytic approach. Islahi, mostly vertical, which is looking at structure. Tabatabai, mostly horizontal, which is cross-referencing. Again, on emphasis, that doesn't mean that Tabatabai does not look at the whole, but that's what comes outstanding. Islahi emphasizes on the general theme of the Quran. Tabatabai emphasizes on the link between the Quranic concepts. Islahi tells you what the conclusion is. And that is what I wanted to say, that I said he brings the conclusion at the start. If you are just interested to know what Islahi has to say, if you are, for instance, a devoted student of Islahi, a fan of his interpretation, then you can just read the first few lines after each verse and tells you what the interpretation is. Tabatabai does not tell you the conclusion at the start. He takes you through his journey and he argues for the conclusion. And as I said, sometimes the conclusion is not definite. Sometimes he comes up with different understandings. Islahi makes conclusion definite. Tabatabai often keeps the conclusion open to challenge, either explicitly saying that one may say something like this and leave it there, or come up with more than one conclusion, or even at the time where he is fixing on one conclusion, he has provided you with so many analyses that as if he's opening your mind to question any of those and to come up with something different. Islahi invests on the current order of the Quran, but you see less emphasis on the current order of the Quran by Tabatabai. If we try to seek a possible synergic effect, and that is where I said that we can talk about future research, just imagine that if we can, inspired by the work that Islahi has done, if we can formulate a detailed structure and storyline for the Quran, even if we do not consider the order of the chapters to be divine, still if we can come up with formulating a detailed structure and storyline for the Quran, so that holistic approach, and then inspired by Tabatabai, if we can come up with a systematic analysis of the relevant verses and concepts in the Quran, what we will end up with will be a stronger, holistic, analytic approach to interpretation of the Quran. I put the word stronger there because I'm very much aware that there are already many scholars that are looking at both of them together. I'm not saying that this will give us something new. I'm saying that learning from both scholars can bring us to a more stronger, holistic, analytic approach to interpretation of the Quran. And that is my 45 minutes. And thank you very much.